Whistler's work in watercolor, and I'm going to just get us started with a couple of broad questions, and then we'll turn it over to you in the audience because I'm sure you'd like to partake of their expertise as well. And Emily, we'll just pass back and forth. Okay. Couple of things come to mind here. I mean, in my opening remarks, I mentioned that one of the things that was sort of driving Whistler when he took up watercolor in the 1880s, it was this kind of duality. On the one hand, a desire to create a legacy. He often talked about how it was the artist's business to carry on tradition, but he was also driven by a desire to make money. And so it would be really interesting to hear a little bit more just about the state of the respective art markets in both the United States and in Britain, and why the state of that market sort of drew Whistler to watercolor.
Is this on? Oh, good. So in England, there was a Royal Academy, which kind of was the highest level of art exhibition space, and mostly oil paintings. Watercolor artists were not allowed there for a long time, and so watercolor societies were formed to give them a venue and to give them a market. And there was always an interest in England because everybody learned to sketch in watercolor, and people often say the way to understand and appreciate watercolor is to try to do it yourself because it's easy to take up but very hard to master. And so there was always this appreciation in England for the watercolor sketch. And it began to be exhibited. It became a kind of, very sort of almost elitist market for it, but very much in demand. And so I think that these exhibition spaces, the interest in them, all of this was showing Whistler that this was a market that he could get into and profit from.
But at the same time, did he participate in any of these organized watercolor societies, or did he seek to kind of distinguish himself from them in a certain way?
Yeah, no, he was always his own man, and he wouldn't exhibit with them because he had to determine every single detail of the exhibition. If he'd shown his watercolors in with all the others, it would have been blown off the wall because they're very small, they're very had just often a limited palette, and so he had to create the ideal conditions for seeing them. But that added to their cachet, I think. It was just like his, so many images of his studio. There's a sort of mystery around Whistler, and he often opened up his door for people to come and see what he was working on. But I think he never thought he was going to become a popular artist, but he very much wanted to appeal to a kind of elite, progressive patron.
In the United States, the whole watercolor movement was totally driven by these market forces. And the Watercolor Society in New York was very straightforward about their marketing. They were trying to get people to buy watercolors. And then as that happened, and generally because watercolors were less expensive than oils, as that started to happen, that created a snowball. That is, as artists started to sell their watercolors, and Homer, for example, when he sent those little boys in the rowboats that I showed you from 1873, his very first trial at the Watercolor Society, he sold a bunch of them. So you better believe that the next year he was back with more because he was selling them. Okay, so this was happening in New York, that they were finding a middle-class collecting audience that previously had not been able to afford the art market. I mean, even a small oil painting might cost several $100s, but you could buy, and don't you wish you had a time machine, you could buy that little boy in the rowboat for $50 at the watercolor exhibition, okay? So people were buying watercolors. That, as I said, created a sort of crescendo of interest as more and more artists began to pile into the watercolor exhibition. And if you can recollect that slide that I showed you of the little boys coming up the stairs with the Japanese parasol over the skylight and the potted palms and so forth, to show you the elaborateness of the installation strategy at the Watercolor Society. In that very article, which was called John Angelo at the Watercolor Society, it was about two little boys that go to the watercolor exhibition and what they found. And one little boy turns to another little boy in the text and says, "Hooray for watercolors at prices everyday folks can afford." I mean, it was just so clear that this was meant to be reaching a new collecting audience. And so that's why, although I have zero evidence to this, I feel like Whistler's spending a year in the company of the men who had just come from New York and were all busy making watercolors in Venice. They must have said at dinner table conversation, watercolors are selling. They're selling big in New York. It's a phenomenon. I know very little about the London market, but I do know that in 1885, the Royal Institute of Painters and Watercolors, one of the two big old, 70-year-old clubs in London, opened a new building, a beautiful new building, with a lot of accompanying hoopla. And so I think there was a concurrent surging of interest in watercolor in London at the same time. It was not just something happening in New York, but they were feeding each other because there was so much, transatlantic communication. So the two markets, I think, were both booming.
Right, I think that's right, and it also certainly feeds into this notion of Whistler as a cosmopolitan artist who can't be contained by any kind of national boundaries or expectations, and begins to really see himself operating on a much larger stage, both in terms of marketing and kind of the art historical traditions that maybe not that he sees himself joining, but that he sees himself founding for the future.
To your point about yellow and white.
Right.
One point about that. I think also Whistler before, I mentioned in my talk, he had been doing these big paintings that took a lot of time and he had a lot of trouble completing them, and he had very few patrons who could afford the price for that kind of work. And it left him vulnerable when he fell out with Leyland, for example. That was a big source of money gone. And I think he was trying to spread out his market by making smaller, more affordable works and creating a larger.
Right, and I mean, there is that great letter that he writes to George Lucas, who was this American art dealer living in Paris. He writes Lucas a letter in 1884 saying, please send the rich Americans who've come here to buy art to see my new exhibition. There's plenty for sale, dainty and most portable, so suitable for these travelers to stick into their trunks and so forth and take with them. Now, to your point about the rapidity and the seeming lack of finish, Emily, it would be interesting to hear from you about how Whistler's technique sort of corresponds to other renowned watercolorists, whether in Britain or in the United States. And I'm thinking particularly of his peers who became canonical artists in the history of American art, like Sargent and Homer. And I'm thinking about kind of the avant-garde, very startlingly modern look of Whistler's paintings and how that connects with his technique compared to Homer and Sargent's.
Well, I mean, really one of the biggest differences is that both Homer and Sargent were using underdrawing, so kind of creating a sketch first and to help form the composition of their paintings. And Whistler in the 1880s really stopped using an underdrawing, and that was it's a really big difference. So that there was that, and then what's interesting is, in some ways, for as innovative as Whistler was, his painting style in comparison to Homer and Sargent was actually much less experimental. So while Homer and Sargent were using masks, masking materials in their watercolor paintings and doing a lot of scraping and scratching. I mean, Whistler was doing some sanding and blotting, but he wasn't being nearly as experimental as the Americans were. So it's an interesting dichotomy of he was certainly getting away from tradition by not doing underdrawing, and yet the painting technique itself was slightly more traditional. So I don't quite know where that puts him, but...
Well, I think it does. The perpetual problem with Whistler is where to place him. Is he British or is he American? Is he carrying on tradition or is he founding a more avant-garde? Is he a gateway to modernism? And just before I turn it over to the audience, just to sort of conclude with a major retrospective of American watercolor that took place at the Brooklyn Museum in 1921 the sort of heroes, American watercolor retrospective, and the great heroes of that, seen as sort of ushering in the modern era, were Homer and John Marin. And they were praised for their vigor and spontaneity and sort of inherent Americanness. And Whistler was really talked about just as a foil and was seen as something of a vestige of the previous generation, and it was very gendered language that the critics used. It was seen as more feminine. And so despite the fact that in some ways John Marin was very influenced by Whistler in both his etching and his painting, and certainly that kind of abstract formal quality that Whistler deploys, he's kind of effectively written out of the history of American art, at least as a founder of modernism. And so in many ways, I think he got his wish, which was to be a master without followers, kind of elevated but also eccentric, kind of outside of the mainstream. But it does make it difficult to know how to talk about him, and that's why it's so good to hear how he fits in reality into this broader framework, both in America and Britain. So questions from the audience. I think Ari here is going to run around and use the microphone. We are being recorded, so if you could talk into the mic, that would be super helpful.
Hi, do you hear me? Yes. Do you want me to stand up or just sit? Hi, my name is Monica Dorhai, and I'm senior fellow. I serve also with the archives, American Archives of Art, and Smithsonian Libraries. I'm on developmental assignment. I work as a banker. And my question and a follow-up. My question, with this presentation, will we have any transcripts? Yes or no? And a follow-up, I'm a huge supporter of Whistler, and I've been for a long, long time coming to Whistler talks. I'm a huge supporter. Thank you.
I can quickly answer the first question, which is that won't be transcribed, but we are video recording it. So we'll put the video online probably by tomorrow, so you can revisit this conversation on YouTube or on our website whenever you'd like.
And the other thing to keep in mind too is that we have a publication, Whistler in Watercolor, Lovely Little Games, being sold through Yale and in our bookshop, and that includes a lot more information than we've been able to give, either in the tour upstairs or talk about today, particularly in terms of a lot of the research and analysis. So that can be found in the book.
Remember the women. I'm curious, Kathleen, about the mother's role in teaching watercolor, and did Whistler's mother teach him watercolor?
I don't know. I'm just asking that question to myself as we were listening. I was listening to his background. Maybe Lee knows the answer to that.
I don't think so, but I guess I haven't sifted through a huge amount of her letters are held at the New York Public Library. And I have to admit, I haven't gone and read all of those. But in ones that I've read a lot of the Whistler correspondence, and so far there's been nothing talking about his mother teaching him. I mean, he definitely learned from painters in St. Petersburg, and he was actually also taught by the older Weir at West Point, Robert Weir, right. So, yes,
I'm waiting to
so.
Take the Whistler's mother and make it into a meme that has her holding a watercolor in her hand.
Well, it's a curious list. I hope you'll continue and let us know.
Well, for Homer's mother actually exhibited her watercolors before he did. So I think she was egging him on. Yeah.
Whether or not she had anything to do with his artistic education, and it's true, in all of my reading of both his correspondence and his mother's, there's no evidence of that. She very early on took on the marketing of his work and began to promote it to her friends and colleagues in America, even before Whistler himself envisioned, a transatlantic market for his art. She actually died shortly before he began his surge of watercolor painting in 1882, 83. So she didn't live to see that become a significant part of his oeuvre, but was very invested in his career and his financial success.
And it's interesting because she does also make a comment early on in Whistler's career about how she had gone to a watercolor show and how she said, "Oh, Jemmy, I went to see works from your favorite media." And I'm sorry? Oh, and they were Turner's. Oh, yes, that's right. It was an exhibition of Turner watercolors. She said, "I went to go see your favorite, style of art." So she knew early on that Whistler, loved watercolor painting, which makes it to me even more interesting that he didn't take it up again until way later, because it was something that he apparently was always quite fond of.
Yeah, a lot of us here today are painters, and Whistler's use of white is something that's tremendously interesting to us. And not only that he used it, but what white paints he might have used, because Chinese white is very, very different from zinc white. But it's never included in the labeling.
Well, actually, Chinese white is zinc white. They're the same thing.
Chinese white is like Kleenex. It's a trade name. Chinese white was a copyrighted trade name.
In modern terms, you can buy a Chinese white, which is a watercolor, and a zinc white, which is a gouache. And the zinc white is much more opaque. So in modern terms, they're different.
Huh. I would have to look into in today what those two pigments are made of, because I wasn't familiar that there was a difference today between zinc white and Chinese white. Yeah. But back in that time period, Chinese white was zinc white.
Okay.
And it was sort of was a newer pigment and it was also was really called Chinese white initially by Winsor and Newton. They coined that term, and they basically said that they had refined the pigment in such a way that it was made it even better than zinc white. But really, it still was zinc white. Now, what Whistler used early on, though, was he was using lead white, which was a terrible watercolor pigment. It was made as lead white was made as a watercolor paint early on, but then they found that it darkened, and that's when zinc white really came in, and Chinese white, and supplanted.
Yeah, that would be a very interesting thing, though, to include on your labeling.
On the labels upstairs, you mean? Oh,
yes.
Yes. We are. I have to tell you, we're very limited by the amount of information we can put on, and so it's a real struggle to get out all the information. Okay. Oh, and that's another reason why we're going to do this website, is to really get out. We've got so much more information to tell and give that the website's going to allow us to do that.
Oh, that'll be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
To your point, though, there have been, and you even commented on how sap green was a different thing to two different color makers, and how white is a different thing to different color makers even today. This, I think, tremendously brave consortium of paper conservators got together in order to try to invent terminology that everyone can use that says the same thing. And so there is actually a website out there that has this terminology. And when we did the watercolor exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, we tried to use that lexicon, which is to say, on the label or in the caption of a photograph of a book, to say watercolor and opaque watercolor. In other words, even the term gouache can be very different to different, and since most objects we can't actually scrape off a tiny piece of the pigment and test it to see what's in it, all we can say is it's opaque watercolor. That's about the best you're going to get on a label, is what I'm saying to you who are seeking more information, because oftentimes it takes very fancy testing and testing that actually It might literally destroy the object to test it, to find out what it's made of. So we're never going to know what some of these pigments are. So all we can say is watercolor and opaque watercolor.
But the one interesting thing is that traditionally, like, opaque watercolor is thought to be the watercolor paint, but with white added to make it opaque. And what's so interesting about Whistler is that he added this zinc white in everywhere, and yet half of the watercolors he added it to are very transparent. So what do we call them? Do we call them opaque because they've got the white, or do we call them transparent because they're transparent? So it really gets tricky.
But it's a big issue with contemporary watercolor painters about whether or not opaque pigments are okay, like whether they're orthodox or unorthodox. And I've had many watercolor artists, especially who came to see the exhibition in Philadelphia, who were astonished by the amount of opaque watercolor that was going on. And all of your heroes, Sargent, Homer, the rest, they're all mixing white in.
That's the whole dirty little secret, is that there was no actual pure British technique, right? They were all using white.
Yeah, but I mean, Ruskin himself, who was like the fountainhead of information about watercolor painting from the middle of the century with a famous handbook, he advocated mixing white into your aerial tints, into the clouds, into the sky, into the distant mountains, because he said just a little bit of that white makes it very soft and atmospheric, gives you a great sense of distance and of space between you and the far distance. So the idea that like opaque white was like a no-no, I mean, many artists were using opaque white.
I think we have time for one more question, if anybody has something on their mind.
If I may, a couple of random comments which you can respond to or not. In terms of female support and encouragement of watercolor, I would certainly look at Elizabeth Boot Duveneck, because she was certainly the motivation behind Duveneck establishing the school in Venice and attracting the students there. And it would be fabulous, and I think the resources have not been discovered of Duveneck boys and watercolors by that group of followers. That would be fabulous to discover as a random...
You're assigned. You're assigned.
With your help. Another comment, there is absolute evidence that Whistler was begging the Duveneck boys for money in July of 1880 to sustain his existence. My thought being, he probably could not afford watercolor pigments in 1880 in Venice, just a thought.
Well, he did have watercolors with him in Venice, or maybe he was borrowing them. We don't know. Is that what you think?
I definitely think there's a good chance he was borrowing from the Duveneck boys and all the people he was with in Venice, because we have
No, he was begging for money.
Well, for money as well, but I also think he may have been borrowing paints.
Well, and using Otto Bacher's printing press, so sure. My final thought is modernism. Proto-modernism. Lee, we actually need more investigation into that concept. His watercolors, the abstraction, the dissolution of form is astounding. It's truly astounding. And right at 1900, you have people, Whistler, John White Alexander, Edward Steichen. There's this gray area that really needs to be explored about proto-modernism.
I couldn't agree more, Marianne, and I think that one of the things that's really made it so problematic to situate Whistler in this sort of normative narrative of modernism is the fact that so many of his works ended up here in the Freer Gallery of Art, where the context for understanding them was either kind of genteel tonalism that Kathy talked about, or a broader kind of multicultural narrative of beauty, where his work was seen as kind of the culmination of a cosmopolitan or global tradition of artistic practice. And so he was effectively removed from that discourse and really became I don't want to say that he was an anachronism, but he came to be seen as something of an anachronism because of kind of the institutional history of collecting his work. We're going to take one more question from Lee Culver, and I want to say that when I announced her forthcoming program in September, I got the date wrong with Peter. Peter Ulrich and Lee Culver will be doing the lecture and painting demonstration not on September 21st, but on September 22nd. So mark your calendars, and Lee, you get the last question.
Thank you. I just want to say we're so excited that you've done this show, and I've had the chance to get a sneak preview of the catalog, which has so many smart observations, and I was really excited to read it, so thank you. Is there, with Alfred Stieglitz promoting small-scale, intimate settings and works on paper, and clearly Marin and others, watercolors, and George O'Keeffe's early watercolors, have we found, or has anyone found a very direct connection of anything that Stieglitz has said that is sort of, connected to any interest or understanding of what Whistler had contributed? And
it's a really, that's a dissertation topic or a book topic for somebody because it's sort of untapped territory. I think in terms of what happens in America, say after 1909 or so, and where sort of the Whistler-Freer nexus fits into it, is Agnes Meyer is a connection, because she was kind of interacting with both Freer and with Stieglitz. I think that certainly Stieglitz, and even his early work in sort of a more pictorialist vein, is clearly derived from Whistler. But that link seems to get severed in the wake of the Armory show. And a different lineage develops. I don't know, I mean, what do you all have other thoughts about that?
Stieglitz showed Marin's etchings, and Marin's etchings are definitely the child of Whistler. I mean, so that story is powerful. He definitely showed works in all media. One of the things that Stieglitz always said as a kind of cornerstone of his gallery approach was that any medium can be expressive and powerful, that there is no hierarchy. It's not like oil painting is better than pastel or photography. I mean, photography was definitely in the mix. And so it was that kind of democratization of the media, which is, in a way, Whistler is a poster child for that, for working across media and from being very experimental. But I agree with you completely. It's a topic that needs to be mined a little bit deeper.
And even, I mean, when Martha Tedeschi did her big study of the Marin watercolors, she definitely, as a Whistler scholar, links Marin to Whistler, but in kind of the art historical literature, that connection isn't really emphasized. And I mean, I think that Brooklyn Museum exhibition of 1921 sort of set the stage for pushing Whistler off to the side as kind of an eccentric or vestige of the past century. So anyway, thank you all very much. Please go upstairs and enjoy the exhibition.